diplomacy in the early Cold War years, 1945 to 1963. On April 25, 1945, Soviet and American troops met at the River Elbe in Germany, marking an important step nearing the end of World War II in Europe. It was an occasion of goodwill and friendship, smiles all around, and from the outside we might assume that the two sides were best of friends. Students often ask, how is it that the Americans and the Russians went from being allies in World War II to such bitter rivals in almost the immediate aftermath of the war? And in fact, I think it's important to note that the alliance between the Americans and the Russians was always an uneasy one. And when I teach my upper-level classes on the Cold War itself, the question really becomes, how did the Americans and Russians ever become allies during World War II, rather than how did they go from being friends to being enemies? The rivalry between the Americans and the Russians, who become the Soviets, in many ways extends all the way back to World War I or even earlier. Certainly during the war, the two sides came together to fight a common enemy. But as I've mentioned, the alliance was always an uneasy one. FDR and Stalin did not get along as swimmingly as FDR did with Churchill, for instance. And Stalin always resented Churchill and FDR for their slowness in opening the Second Front and launching what became the D-Day invasion. And we've talked about some of the other points of contention between the two sides as the war drew its close. So, in fact, the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union extends back far earlier than just World War II itself, and as we will see, what comes to be known as the Cold War really has its origins during World War II itself. The origins of the Cold War can be found in the later stages of World War II itself, as all of the different combatants began to meet and consider what would the world look like in the aftermath of this war. There were several different conferences between leaders of the major Allied nations. We talked about the Tehran Conference previously, which primarily served to plan for the D-Day invasion. The next of the great conferences was the Yalta Conference, held in February of 1945. And the picture on the right is actually from that conference of Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. If we think about where we are in terms of the timing of things, February 1945, well, we're well past the D-Day invasion. In fact, we are past the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans have made their last great attempt to make an offensive push, and now they are being driven back. So this conference is actually being held during the period that I described in the World War II lectures as the race to Berlin, the Russian troops closing in from the east and the British and American troops closing in from the west. In fact, we're just a couple of months away from the meeting that I've described on the previous slide of the Russian and American troops. In other words, we're getting pretty close to the end of the war, and it is beginning to look inevitable that the Allies are going to prevail. And so when they met at Yalta, the leaders decided on several different things that would come into play when the war ended. Among them, they decided to divide Germany amongst the Allies. In fact, initially, Germany would be divided into 4 different quadrants, one each for American, French, and British influence, along with the Russian zone. As you probably know, eventually those zones would be winnowed down to 2, and through most of the Cold War, we're familiar with thinking about East and West Germany. But in the immediate aftermath, there would be 4 zones. The city of Berlin, the capital city, would also be divided into 4 zones, which is going to lead to some interesting questions because Berlin lies deep within the Russian zones, actually fairly close to Poland and moving into what becomes the Soviet Union. So that will create a problem, this little pocket of American, French, and British influence deep within the Russian zone. It was also decided at Yalta to essentially give Poland to the Russians when the war was over, and Poland would be consumed by the Soviet Union. And while FDR has taken some criticism for this, we have to consider the situation as they were meeting at Yalta. In fact, the Red Army already occupied most of Poland, and so it would have been a question of how do we get the Russians out of Poland. We weren't going to go to war with Russia to force them out of Poland. So, in essence, this was had already been done. Over the following months, the decisions made at Yalta would be put into practice. First of all, we noted this race to Berlin. It was the Russians who won the race to Berlin. There's a picture there at the bottom of Russian troops raising the flag over the ruins of Berlin. And so the Red Army assumed much of Germany under its control. Another element of what happens in the aftermath of Yalta is that FDR, as I noted previously, died on April 12, 1945, and Harry Truman took over as president. Well, Truman was, in some ways, a tougher negotiator than FDR had been. I talked about his Napoleon complex. He was a little bit more aggressive. He definitely didn't want to be pushed around by Stalin. And Truman made the decision not to inform Stalin about the atomic bomb. This was one more sort of needle in the side of Stalin. As I mentioned to you, he was already frustrated by a number of things. He really didn't feel a very close part of the alliance with Britain and the United States. And this is just one more example. And making matters worse was that due to spies on the inside, Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb, and so when Truman withheld that information, and specifically he didn't tell him about it at another conference which was called the Potsdam Conference, when a number of these things are going to be enacted, it only added to Stalin's frustration. So this is a map of what Germany was to look like in the aftermath of World War II. Germany and Austria as well divided into 4 quadrants. And just note for the moment the city of Berlin and its location. It's far to the east in the Russian or Soviet zone and what would become East Germany. And so when you have that little pocket of American and French and British influence, it's going to be a sore spot with the Russians down the road, and it's going to create some problems. Of course, we will talk about the Berlin airlift, and then you're probably familiar with the Berlin Wall as well that goes up in the middle of that city. So we can talk about 2 great realities that hang over really the duration of the Cold War and certainly the post-war world. One of them is the idea of the world divided. While you can't necessarily draw a wall or a very clean line between the zone of Soviet influence and the zone of American influence, you can come pretty close, and there are certainly parts of the world where the divide is very clear between the Soviet area of influence and the American area of influence. But the reality is that much of the world falls under one camp or another, and it gets to be harder and harder to be neutral or to be untied with one nation or the other. The other great reality of the Cold War is the atomic bomb. It is the atomic age. And we will only be adding to the atomic arsenals on both sides. And this is a point we will come back to several different times. but it's not too far down the road. By the early 1950s, there is enough atomic weaponry on both sides that if World War III were ever to begin, the world would simply be annihilated, and the human race would be annihilated, which leads us to a very interesting and in some ways terrifying situation, and that is that at any moment World War III could break out, and that would mean the destruction of all of us. So these are really kind of the two great overarching themes of the Cold War. The two spheres of influence between the Soviets and the United States, and then the atomic bomb that kind of hangs over everything. And this cartoon, I think, summarizes the situation quite well. It's a cartoon from the 1950s, but it applies equally well to the 1980s. You see the sort of idyllic 1950s happy American household situated on top of the atomic bomb, which teeters between world control and world destruction. And I think if you had to summarize the entirety of the Cold War in one picture, this is it. Essentially, that atomic bomb has us always teetering on the brink of world destruction.